All right. So let's jump right into it. So today we're going to cover a bunch of different things. We're going to cover interview season 101, kind of give you the nuts and bolts of what to expect going into the next couple of weeks and months. We'll talk about interview day structure. We'll talk about commonly asked interview questions that you should be preparing for, how to prepare those high quality responses. And then one thing that we're doing really cool this time that we've never done before is we're doing a live mock interview. So we're going to show you how we would take on if we were working with you as a client, how would we work with someone as far as like, what's a good response, what's a bad response, and how to kind of change how you get that kind of feedback when you work with an advisor from our team. So let's jump right into it. So, what to expect? Interviews are kind of happening. Interviews are going to get released anytime from now until December. So you might already have colleagues, depending on your specialty, depending on what programs you apply to, who already got interviews, right? And that's like kind of might come as a shock. You're like, wow, I just submitted ERAS 2 days ago. There's already an interview in my inbox, and why did he or she get one and I didn't? And that can be a little bit frustrating if you're kind of on the side of the fence where you didn't get one yet. But I can assure you, all right, this happens every year. We have a lot of people who are really anxious about this. Need not worry. All right, it's very program and specialty specific. And also, a lot of programs actually will extend interviews multiple times throughout the season. So don't worry about that. The most important thing to worry about interviews is that it really is a first come, first serve thing. All right. You need to be really like aware of your email inbox, set your alerts, set your notifications, and you have to respond to these invitations very, very fast because the slots will fill up and a lot of programs tend to overlap as far as the days that they will interview on. And so in order for you to kind of be in a position where you can hopefully take on the amount of interviews that you want to take on to match successfully, you want to be able to respond to the emails as early and efficiently and timely as possible. Okay, another piece of advice that I'll say that I remember from when I was interviewing that was really helpful was keeping a calendar. Right, you want to have a separate calendar just for your interviews that you can easily access on your phone or computer or both, ideally. So you can basically always know, okay, I am available on that day and not on that day. Like, and you're able to just make that decision on the fly. And it's not something you have to be like, oh, let me wait till I get home to figure out what day works best for me. All right. The other things in the bottom, I think, are things that, as typical as neurotic medical students, like most of us are, it's going to be really hard for us to do. But relax. All right, this is like kind of like right now, all you could do is wait. There's not really much action for you to take. Hopefully, you already worked to put your best foot forward to get the application in, to basically be to showcase to programs how hard you've worked over the last 3 years. Now it's time for them to, they kind of take the wheel. They're going to be the ones inviting you and the kind of, stressing over whether it be on Reddit or Discord or even talking to people about it. And as much as like misery loves company and it's good to talk about these things, a lot of the times it's really just a lot of anxiety provoking behavior. So I just do advise you to try to stay away from it because it's not really adding a lot of value to your life. Let's just put it that way. And lastly, prepare yourself accordingly, which is what we're going to talk about in just a second. All right. So this is just something that I wanted anyone, who's currently an MS4, I want you to kind of be aware of these things and to be, kind of aside from just actually preparing for the interview, this is kind of stuff that, things that I wish someone told me when I was going through the process. As far as the interview itself, I think it's really important to know what to expect, right? So I think most interviews are very kind of predictable. You're gonna walk in. There's almost always like some sort of like introduction. There's maybe a little meet and greet thing, like an informal thing, or like there's a PD presentation. They'll tell you kind of about the call schedule, the benefits, a little bit about the resident profile, where the residents usually come from, things like that, right? And so I think those things are basically very standard. I think programs that don't do this is that it's probably a red flag that I would take note of. And then, you'll have your interview sessions, and there's going to be anywhere from 1 to 8 actual interviews, depending on if it's like a preliminary year, which sometimes can just do like one interview, or if it's like a surgical subspecialty, which I have heard can be up to 8 like interviews in one day. So, depending on what specialty you're applying for, your experience can vary. I would say on average, you're looking at 3 to 4 interviews, probably in that range for most programs and specialties on average. So it's something to be aware of. And the interviews themselves can last anywhere from like 10 minutes up to 30 minutes for each individual interview within the interview day. So the days can get long. I think my longest interview was like a 6 hour day. And it's like, it can be exhausting and taxing. And you kind of have to be ready to be on for that whole time. So I kind of think that, these are some things to keep in mind. The programs will usually send you at least by the day before, they'll send you like your schedule, what time you're slotted for. Sometimes there's breaks built into the day. So a lot of this stuff will be like kind of like transparent as you go forward, but this is just some stuff to think about as well. Another thing I'll say is, with any interview, you want to be set up well with your like environment, right? So make sure that you have like, if you're using like, know where you're doing your interview, make sure it's a quiet place, make sure you have a blank background, or if there is anything in your background, make sure that it's something that you're prepared to discuss. If you have a musical instrument in your background or an interesting painting or something like that, people have gotten asked stuff about things going on in their background. So if you don't want to talk about it, make sure you're in a place that's like what I got behind me, which is just a blank wall. All right. So keep that in mind. Ian, do you want to add anything else to interview day structure or anything to expect as far as kind of like logistical things?
Yeah, one thing I'll say is, you'll typically be interviewing with just one faculty member or one resident or the PD, but at times they do have panel interviews or a group of faculty members that may be interviewing, at the same time. Usually this isn't a big deal. Usually it's pretty similar, but sometimes it can be a little intimidating or feel like you're being ganged up on if your answers aren't going the best. But typically everyone's just trying to get to know you. So don't be worried if you're scheduled with more than one interviewer at the same time.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Very rare that happens, but it can. It can. I've definitely had a couple of two-on-one sessions, and it can be very intimidating, but you got to put your best foot forward and you just gotta take one question at a time, address one person at a time like you would if it was a one-on-one. All right. Let's talk about these classic interview questions. All right. So these 10 questions, I'm not going to read every single one. You guys can take pictures, you can do whatever you want. These are the classic 10 questions that I think every single person on this call and every single person applying to residency in general should be aware of, right? You not only be aware of them, you should be prepared with a full-blown answer on how to tackle these questions. And not just in your head. My advice is really write out your answers, get it down on paper, recite it to yourself. All right. Rehearse it to someone else. Rehearse it to an advisor from our team, your mentor, your classmate, someone. Right. And I think, the same piece of advice that we gave to people like preparing their personal statements is the same piece of advice I'm going to give you here. I think multiple perspectives are extremely valuable. And ideally, you want to hear perspectives from people in different positions, right? You want to hear from perspectives from people that are maybe your peers. You want to hear perspectives from people that are in medicine but are senior to you. So whether it's a resident or attending or some other advisor or mentor within the medical community, you want to hear perspective from people that are in a different industry entirely. Maybe they're in law or accounting or finance or whatever. They've gone through job interviews. They might not know the nooks and crannies of why you want to do surgery, but guess what? I think a person who's like in a successful kind of professional field and has done well in interviews will know a good interview answer from a bad one, right? Because at the end of the day, the point of the interview is to sell yourself and to demonstrate your candidacy and your fit for a program and ultimately a job, right? And so kind of, the interview is one of the most standardized things that I think the residency application process has compared to other job application processes, right? So don't be shy to get advice or feedback from people just because they're not in medicine. So yeah, writing out your answers, practicing them, getting feedback, and just understanding how to keep these answers powerful yet concise. Because hearing yourself or when you're giving an answer to just kind of drone on for like 5 minutes consecutively is a very bad look. It's something that actually a lot of people make the mistake of. They don't realize how long they're talking for. And you should really be mindful of that. And I think that's where practicing and timing yourself and all that actually comes into a big play as well. So that's a little bit about that. As far as the questions themselves, I think these questions are basically, you know, specialty independent, right? So I think these are questions that you can hear regardless of the specialty you're applying for. Now, obviously, there's going to be other things that can come up as far as, you're going to be asked about your application. You might be asked about ethical scenarios and how you would respond to them. You might be asked the crazy left field questions. You might be asked a random question about which utensil would you be and why, right? Or, which character trait do you feel like you would buy more of if you were in a store that you can buy any character trait in the world, and why? So those are questions, by the way, I've been asked both of those questions on the interview trail. Um, Questions that you can't prepare for, right? You're not gonna just prepare the answer of like, what utensil am I going to be? Like, why am I going to be a cheese grater, right? That's not something that you're just going to know that you're going to be asked of. And the point of those questions is actually not to be prepared. Rather, it's to test whether you prepared the answers to the standard questions and did enough self-reflection and introspection to know how to come up with a good answer on the fly, right? That's actually the point of those questions. So just because you see these questions here doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to just be limited to these, right? You're actually going to be asked about a lot of different things, which kind of ties into the next thing, right? Preparing high quality responses. I think we covered a couple of these. I'm going to go over these because I think this is probably one of the most important slides of the whole presentation. I think you want to demonstrate that you're a genuine person. The things in your application are truthful, right? You actually had those research and leadership and other extracurricular experiences that you wrote about. You want to be able to communicate them clearly. You're applying for your first job as a physician, where communication is literally the single most important thing, both with your colleagues and with your patients. So you want to be able to demonstrate that you can confidently articulate yourself and your ideas. And it's certainly, it's hard to trust someone in the job of a physician if they can't even articulate ideas and kind of concepts about themselves, let alone other things and other people, right? So that's really important. But in that same vein, you want to be confident without being arrogant. And I think a lot of people don't have until you hear yourself, it's actually really hard to understand, how do I draw that line? Is that answer coming off a little bit too much? Is it coming off like without even me knowing it or intending it? Am I being cocky? Is it a little bit egregious? Or am I actually sounding a little bit wishy-washy? Am I sounding like I never, I don't really have enough confidence? Maybe somebody would question whether I even actually did that experience or activity, right? And then again, conciseness, really limiting yourself to, I would say 2 minutes is really like the maximum in interview response time for most questions. Like more than 2 minutes is going to be like, you're going to lose people. They're going to either stop listening or check out. Attention span. It's not, we're not the same as we used to be in the era of social media and the kind of dopamine rush of the iPhone and everything. Like we're not built to like pay attention for a long time. It's really sad, but it's the truth. And so you need to be able to kind of cater to people on the other side who are listening, who are, have the same attention span that we all do, which has kind of been artificially limited by the stimuli around us. I think tying in your response to your application theme is one of the things that people struggle with, right? So I think everybody has an application theme. So, there's a certain kind of theme that you portrayed, whether you have a lot of teaching experience, a lot of volunteer experience, you're really passionate about one specific thing, whether it be one of your hobbies, or maybe it is your research or whatever, right? I think it's really important. And I think it actually makes the good applicants stand out from the great ones, right? I think when you're able to tie in a response to a question with the underlying theme that you have as an applicant and as a person, I think that makes you a lot more memorable, because now you're not only giving the good answer, but you're also able, like, kind of like subconsciously signaling to the interviewer that you are the person that does X, Y, or Z really well. And now they remember you as that person, right? They remember you as, oh yeah, that's the guy that like was really into mentorship, right? That's the guy that was really into the guitar and or whatever other experience it is, right? And they kind of like take that away, and you're able to become memorable when it comes down to finalizing rank lists and things like that. I think the bottom three we talked about: responses, feedback, practice, and making sure you have a good environment. I'm going to turn it over to Ian. See what Ian, what else do you have? What else do you have to add to all of the students on the call about, as far as like when they're kind of getting in this mindset, preparing for these responses.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two main thoughts. First one is we kind of talked about really important to have a well-prepared answer to those 10, most important questions that you're going to hear on the interview trail. One thing to think about is those questions are not always going to be asked in those exact words, but they may be more or less asking the same thing. So if someone says, tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. That's very similar to tell me about a really difficult time or any other phrasing of this kind of question. You may even get in the situation where your interviewer kind of ends up asking you the same question more than once in the interview, just in slightly different ways. So it might even behoove you to have kind of like a backup answer to some of these like really important things. You can be asked about a challenge in your life in the non-clinical setting, in the clinical setting, in the education setting. So it doesn't really hurt to prepare multiple good answers to some of these things. And it kind of gets your juices flowing. And then you generally just become a better interviewee and better at answering these questions and better at developing answers on the fly. The second point that I'll say is it's really great to have a well-rehearsed answer, but you don't want to come across too rehearsed. That's probably better than being really unprepared, but being too rehearsed is going to sound robotic. People will be able to tell that you've given the answer this way, however many times before. So practice when you're timing yourself, when you're practicing these answers, giving it in a natural delivery, how you would if you were having a conversation. And people are going to remember you as a lot more affable, a lot more like someone that they would, want to get along with or spend time with, even outside the clinical setting. And that'll go a long way towards your candidacy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You definitely don't want to sound like you memorized your answers. And you also, I've seen this happen as someone who does a lot of mock interviews and as someone who also interviews people for my own residency program. Don't read your answers off the screen. Okay, please don't do that. All right. It's very easy to tell and it's not natural and it's just like a bad look. All right. It just shows that like it gives the impression that you can't like speak as a human, right? Which is like the fundamental goal of the interview. So yeah, don't read your answers off the screen. All right. So a couple other things that, some of these things we've talked about, some of these things we haven't. Know the program. All right. So this is a really like an underrated thing. Like you don't want to walk into an interview just knowing yourself and knowing your application, right? Which is the next point, right? You want to know everything on your application and you want to be really convincing to someone that you actually mean what you say you did and that you actually did those things. But you want to know the program, right? You want to know like what's the vibe? What does this program pride themselves in? What is the city all about? What do I know? What ties do I have to this area, region, city, or program that I can bring up? What are the interviewers themselves into, right? Some of them are going to be like the research heads of the program. Some of them are going to be really into like one specific like service line, one specific pathology. They might be experts in a specific domain, or they might be known for something else entirely, but something that's like still kind of public knowledge. Do the digging, put in the work, because if you put in that work, you're able to have a much more engaging and meaningful conversation with them. And that ultimately translates to a more memorable conversation when they're actually thinking about who they interviewed that day. All right. So going into this prepared with that knowledge is critical. All right. The other thing we said, keep it tight, 2 minutes. All right. Have questions to ask them. I think at the end of every interview that I had, they always love saying, do you have any questions for me? And I think you drop the ball completely if you just say, no, I'm good. I'm good. Right. This is your one chance to interface with a program that you, again, might spend 3 to 7 years at. Now, even if you rotated there or you have a sibling in there or whatever connection you have, right? I don't care. Come up with a question to ask that's thoughtful, that shows that you're really interested. And depending on what level of involvement you have with the program, right? If you did rotate there, you can ask a higher level question. You can ask something that's way more in depth. That's something, that only someone who rotated there would know about. You can, you know what I mean? If you've never heard of the place or, you kind of like you have no connection or affiliation with the program, you can ask a more basic question, just about the logistics of living in XYZ city, or, how does, other kind of questions though, like whatever interests you, like genuinely, what do you need to know to make the decision whether or not you want to be at that place for 3 to 7 years, right? No question is a bad question if it's asked with intent. And I think that the PDs are there to, answer those questions. They want to know that you're interested. Because if you don't have questions, that means you're probably not interested. All right. And the last thing is to name drop thoughtfully. So when you're name dropping, meaning if you know a resident or if you've rotated there and you know an attending, you have certain relationships with people, somebody wrote your letter, or whatever it is, if you're ever talking about an individual that isn't yourself, you have to be really careful with how you do this, right? Make sure that you're doing this in a way that's professional and also in a way that if that person is contacted, you want to make sure that they are going to have positive things to say about you, and you have no doubt in your mind that they are going to be positive. Otherwise, don't do it. Because if you name drop, by the way, that's like going to bypass the whole interview process, right? If someone goes to my program director and says, "Oh yeah, I know Dan. Dan was my advisor, or Dan was my tutor, or whatever. I know Dan, or we rotated there, and I worked with him for a couple of weeks on the IR service." My PD is literally not even going to grade your interview. He's just going to text me and be like, "Hey, what do you think about XYZ?" They said they know you. And my whatever I say to that text is going to basically determine that, like, how his impression of you, right? And I think that is like really, really important to remember. Don't just name drop for the sake of name dropping. Make sure that it's someone that you have a good relationship with, who you know is going to back you in the event that they are contacted about you. Think we kind of beat a lot of these points to the bush. So let's see. I don't know if there's anything else that, Ian, you want to add anything else as far as anything related to interviews that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, the only thing I would recommend with regard to having these questions prepared to ask the programs, kind of think about the audience for the question you want to ask. There's certain questions that are more appropriate for residents if you have time to, speak with residents about the program. There's certain questions that are more appropriate for faculty or junior faculty or people who are involved in the program, but not necessarily maybe making the day-to-day decisions about the program. And then there's questions that are more appropriate for the PD or APD, the people who really are making changes in the program. Don't necessarily ask like a junior faculty member, what changes like have you instituted in the program? Because they'll be like, oh, I don't know how to answer that. I just do interviews for them. Versus asking the PD, that's a more appropriate question, if that makes sense. So just kind of think about who you're going to be asking these questions to, and that's one component of knowing your interviewers, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Same goes with residents, right? I mean, there are definitely certain questions that are far better to ask a resident than to ask an attending, for example. So I think that definitely goes both ways. We're gonna give you guys the opportunity to ask us questions at the end, by the way. And I think Ian, is the chat open right now? So if people want to, I don't know if people, is the
Yeah,
chat open?
it's open right now.
All right, cool. Yeah, so if anybody has questions, you could either say them at the end. We'll allow you guys to, like, drop questions in and we'll chat about them. But otherwise, I think we're going to jump into a live mock interview example. So Ian's going to ask me a question. I'm going to give him an answer, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how we would give feedback, what kind of went well, what didn't go well, and then we'll do it again. We'll do two examples of these.
So, Dan, could you tell me a little bit about why you want to go into radiology?
Yeah, sure. So when I started medical school, I actually wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I approached med school with an open mind. I really didn't know how I'd want to kind of form my career. During my rotations, I would rotate on, internal medicine, and I couldn't help but shake the feeling that, the primary focus there was really on a lot of social issues. I just felt like there was not enough being done for patients, and I didn't enjoy that. I felt like it would be like, I wouldn't be fulfilled doing that. And then I kind of rotated onto surgery after that. And, surgery was really toxic culture. And I really didn't want to be treated that way, the way I saw like the surgical residents treat each other and the way the attendings treated them. And so, I feel like radiology just ended up being this really good fit where, I felt like, I was going to make a positive impact and also have like work in a really amazing culture. And I think that for that reason, I ended up really falling in love with it.
Okay. So let's think about the answer Dan gave, and maybe in all of your heads, think about what was good about it, what was bad about it. So here would be my feedback for Dan if he was a client that I was working with. So it sounds like you really found your, niche in radiology. You figured out what you didn't like about other specialties and you kind of settled on the specialty that you feel more passionate about. The feedback I would have for your answer is that you're really focusing on the negatives of other specialties as opposed to the positives of radiology. So I would think that me as an interviewer, I would be a little turned off if someone is kind of slamming other specialties, even if done in a respectful way, like you did. You weren't being disrespectful per se, and you were saying things that maybe a lot of people feel, but you were focusing a little too much on the negatives. And then I want to know more about why you like radiology. Why is it this good fit for you? Is it something from like an intellectual curiosity perspective where you like the subject matter? Why do you say that the culture is positive? Are you just trying to maybe work less? Which isn't necessarily what radiology interviewers want to hear, but or is there something about radiologists where you feel like they're supportive or there's a certain kind of environment that you enjoy being in? So yeah, I would encourage the mentee to reflect more about what they like about the specialty and really center their answer on that. But other than that, I think, I mean, you delivered a well-spoken answer, a well thought out answer that made sense, but it could have been directed in a better way.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that answer was I think another thing that probably that answer could use is tying in some personal things like we said, like what's the theme of your application, right? Maybe you were really into teaching and you realize that the reading room is an amazing learning environment, like it's a constant place where learning is happening 24/7, right? Maybe you are just a very independent person, right? Maybe you have themes in your application that talk about you being an independent learner or an independent leader, or just maybe you have a personal story of your journey through life and through medicine and even outside of medicine that just really captures this theme of independence. And maybe you kind of realize that, hey, radiology is like a very like self-motivated, self-starter type of field. And that's something that I want to, that's the only specialty that really allows me to like actualize that skill that I've developed over the years, right? So, I think everything that Ian said is 100% valid, right? Definitely don't undermine other specialties. But here's the other, there's also these other considerations, right? Of how to like make this answer yours, right? How is this answer? There's a lot of people that are going to say XYZ field is great because of XYZ. We've all heard it. I'm interviewing 20 people a day for 5 different interview days. I'm going to hear the same stuff 80% of the time. How do you make your answer yours, right? And the only way to do that is one, to like, obviously have an objectively good answer, but then two, make it yours, make it personal. Bring something from your life and your experience into the flesh, into the answer. So hopefully that was helpful. We're going to do another one because I want you guys to get a feel for, the different types of questions that you can get asked, how you might answer them, right? And honestly, how feedback is also delivered for these kinds of things and what goes on in our head, not just as people who are, on our own residencies admissions committee, but also people that basically, interview hundreds of people every single year and give this kind of feedback for MatchPal. So I'm going to ask Ian a question this time. Let's see. So Ian, why don't you tell me about a challenge that you overcame? So tell me a little bit about the challenge, to paint the picture. Tell me about, why it was a challenge and, how you dealt with it.
Yeah, so this question makes me think about a time on my third year internal medicine rotation. So we had a patient come in through the ED and they were complaining of terrible back pain and their lab showed an acute kidney injury. And my residents were really just anchoring on maybe like a pyelonephritis or some other kind of infection. And I just couldn't shake the fact that they were wrong. So like next morning before rounds, I was really taking a closer look at the labs, and I noticed that they also had anemia and hypercalcemia. And once I saw that, I instantly knew they had multiple myeloma. And, I proposed this to the attending at rounds, and I think we made a really life-saving diagnosis that day that no one else had thought of. So I felt like that was a really big accomplishment and, a really big challenge that I had to overcome.
All right. So yeah, same thing. Think about the answer Ian gave. Think about what you guys liked about it, what you didn't like about it. I'll tell you my feedback. So I think it's a story that I think stories are good. All right, I think stories are naturally interesting to hear versus like drier answers. So I think the fact that he's telling a story, I'm okay with that. I like it. I think the attention span for a story is far greater than an attention span for like a regular conversational answer. I think there's a lot of focus in this story on a little bit of like a bragging aspect, right? There's a little bit of like, kind of like, here's what I'm kind of the hero. I'm not really getting a challenge here. And I think this question is posed on purpose because I think this is the question that a lot of us fear, right? We hate talking about a failure, a challenge. We don't want to paint ourselves in the negative light because we're scared that like we're never going to be able to undo it with the answer, right? And so a lot of people talk about like this pseudo challenge, right? the real challenge that Ian could have talked about here is how do I disagree with a senior, right? And essentially, that's kind of what he's underlying. That's what he's trying to convey. He's trying to convey that he's like an MS3. He's on a rotation. He's got these senior residents that don't align, like that aren't like they're not thinking the same way as him. And he's making an astute observation that ultimately goes to do very well for a human being, but he's not communicating it in a way that kind of makes it clear that the challenge was the hierarchical battle that he's facing as a medical student and how he navigated it. Rather, he's kind of focusing on, hey, I'm like, I had this idea, they didn't really see it, I did, and I kind of, I did a good job, right? Versus kind of saying, hey, like I felt really, I felt, disempowered as a junior medical student. It was my first rotation of the year. I disagreed, and I just read about multiple myeloma like the week before, and it was just like happened to be fresh in my head. And I just didn't know how to bring it up when the team was so dead set on this other diagnosis. And that to me was the challenge, right? And in saying that, like that moment, that is the conflict. And then how do you build up the courage? How do you kind of, go about it and then handle it in a professional way? That's how you overcome it, right? And so that's the feedback, right? Again, it's a great story. It's a good example. If you have an example of where you make a positive impact on someone's life, you should share it. But focus on, again, think about the question actually being asked of you and make sure that you're answering it and make sure your answer is focusing in on that. So hopefully those examples are really helpful. All right. And I think for anyone that does interviews with people, right? Just when you're practicing, this is stuff that you don't even realize that you're unintentionally focusing your answers on, right? You don't even have an idea that you might be focusing on the wrong thing until you hear yourself say it or you hear someone else give you feedback on it, which is why it's so important to practice. Ian, anything else before we move on?
Yeah, just on that answer. So it's awesome to talk about patient care scenarios. You're interviewing about yourself. So it's okay to put yourself in the center of those scenarios, but don't forget to keep your answers patient centered. If you are figuring out a diagnosis for a patient, yeah, and you're just like bragging about how you won the game as the medical student, that's not really how you should be thinking about it. Remember that it's a patient on the other side of that diagnosis, and just be really respectful whenever you tell these stories and make sure that you're conveying that you understand. There's a certain level of like maturity with being a physician. So although it's about yourself and then maybe what you went through in the clinical scenario, always use patient-centered language, always kind of keep the patient in mind and be respectful when you're talking about the case.
Absolutely. All right, so we're gonna have time for Q&A right now. I want to tell you, I know we have a lot of familiar names and faces on the call, so thank you all for joining us. For those of you that don't know us, we're basically a team of residents that focus on really making sure that medical students are adequately prepared because we came from places that just didn't do a good job at that. And so we're kind of trying to fill the need and make sure that you're prepared for boards, interviews, ERAS, etc. We cover the full gamut. Everything we do is specialty specific. And we have a lot of experience with it. We've literally worked with over 1,000 clients over the last few years, and we've done I think I would like to say we've done a great job. So, just want to introduce you to us. You should follow us on social media, join us for more events. We're posting tons of free advice. We have free newsletters and events like this all the time. And right now we're in residency interview prep season. So if you're interested in mock interviews, we're happy to do it. So you can scan this to fill out an interest form. We're offering anyone here 10% off. So you can just use the code webinar10 for the mock interview sessions. And also while you're doing that, please feel free to drop any questions that you have about anything we covered in the chat, and we will answer them to the best of our abilities. But other than that, thank you everyone for joining if anyone's going to be logging off. So we already do have some questions, which is awesome. So let's get into it. So we have for interview dress code, is a tie necessary? I would wear a tie. I wore a tie for all my interviews. I think you should wear a tie. Yeah. In person versus virtual, there's an option. Oof. I mean, if you can go in person, I'll probably go in person, right? Like I feel like if it's not going to be like financially or from a time perspective, like really, really difficult for you, I feel like you should try to go in person if you're really interested in the program. So that's my take. I don't know, Ian, do you feel
Yeah.
differently about that?
I think it'll give you better insight for you as to whether or not that's the place you want to end up and if that's a place you should rank highly. I think one of the big cons of the virtual interview process is not getting to know the program and the people as well as you may have done. the in-person interviews. I do think there might also be, even if they say there's no bias, a little bit of subconscious bias towards the people who make the effort to come in. That would be completely unfair because it's like financially prohibitive for a lot of people. But I do think that it's hard to kind of disentangle that and think that there would be no bias towards the people who come in. So, I mean, if you are able to and it's not financially burdensome, I would go. Otherwise, just do your best in the virtual setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, the challenge should be whatever. Like, I mean, I personally like personal challenges much more. I think they're way more interesting, like versus clinical versus or even academic. So I think personal challenges that talk about gripes between, either something that happened to you, to your family, to something like that, that's something that really like had a really deep impact on you and your journey. That's probably the most interesting thing for me to hear as an interviewer.
A
So,
lot of people specify, can you tell me about a clinical challenge? Or they say, tell me about a challenge. It doesn't have to be in medicine. And then
right.
it kind of opens the floor to just give your best answer possible. In that case, just give the best interview answer you have. It could be clinical or non-clinical. They also had a question about name dropping, asking for permission. I think that that's appropriate. If you know the resident decently well, uh,
Yeah.
then maybe like let them know. But if it's like a tenuous thing, maybe the safer thing is to just be like, oh, I spoke with this person about your program. They had good things to say. You're not necessarily acting like you know them super well.
Right.
That would maybe be a middle ground. But if you know them well, you can definitely ask them and tell them that you're going to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a fine line. It really just depends on, how are you going to navigate, what is your relationship, right? If you're confident in the relationship, sure. If you're not confident, do the more, do the more kind of like what Ian said, more gentle approach of just kind of like saying you spoke with them, which doesn't necessarily imply you already have like a really good relationship. As far as taking off time for interviews while on an audition, I think like, audition, when you're on an audition, everyone knows you're an MS4, they know you're in interview season. I think it's pretty normal to ask to take like 2 or 3 days during like a month-long rotation. I would say I don't think anyone can give you strife for it. Try to make sure that it's not all in one week, so you're not like just missing for like a huge chunk of time. And people don't think you're like, I don't know, in the Bahamas or something. But like, I think if you take 2 or 3 days over the course of a month, it's totally fine. More than that is not advisable. I think it could potentially be perceived negatively. So I think trying to do your interviews later on, if that makes things easier when you're not on like an audition, is probably the best thing that I would try to do if I was in those shoes. Notes. Okay, I'm actually really happy you brought this up, Niha. So this is something I actually meant to bring up earlier and I totally forgot. So I think everybody who's on the interview trail, I don't care what specialty you're in, I don't care how competitive you are, it doesn't matter. You should have an Excel file or a Google Doc, and you should have every program that you interview on there. And you should be writing your reflections immediately when the interview day ends or during the breaks or whatever, not during the interview itself, but during any time that you're camera off and allowed to be camera off, you should be writing the impressions that you have from the program. Call schedule, moonlighting, what's the vibe? Did they actually take interest in me? Did they actually ask questions that were thoughtful? Did they make me feel like they actually want to get to know me? Or do they kind of, am I just like another number? Are they just kind of like interviewing me for the sake of interviewing me? And a lot of the stuff that you're thinking about, like that I'm saying right now, you're like, whoa, like that's real? Yes, it's real. There are for sure, even through the Zoom interface, there are vibes that you will feel about it, whether a program is really, really trying to sell you on it and really trying to get to know you, or whether you're just kind of like a safety. And the same way we all have safeties as applicants, programs have safeties on their end as far as interviewees, right? And you're going to feel that vibe. And I think it's a really important thing for you to take into account because guess what? A lot of you on this call are going to have 10 or more interviews. Okay. You're not going to remember by the time it comes down to February. You're not going to remember what you did in November, what that first or second or third interview vibe was like. You need to have a record that you can use to reflect on. All right, Ian, you want to take the next one?
Yeah. How do you recommend structuring the tell me about yourself question? So, really good. This is an important answer. So, I mean, going to be different for everyone, but probably just give a little biographical info at the start. This is who I am. This is where I'm from. Like where I grew up, where I went to medical school, how I got here. Uh, Probably a section that kind of is a nice recap, maybe of some of your application themes or some things that are important to you. Maybe something that's along the lines of a fun fact or something you want them to remember you by or ask you about. And then, just simply stating, I'm really excited to be interviewing here. Thank you for taking the time. Probably keep it under 90 seconds and just have a pretty good structured answer like that.
Love it. I agree. Letters of intent. Yes, definitely send letters of intent for sure. Letters of interest. Sorry. Um, I don't know how much letters of interest play a role in the era of signaling. I feel like the signal is the letter of interest. I don't know, Ian, what do you think about letters of interest these days?
So I applied I believe the first year that signaling was widely used, right? And in my experience, letters of interest in an application that had like six signals probably yielded me one, and I probably sent like 20. So you can think about maybe a 5% yield if you have six signals. And as the number of signals goes up, the relative yield of a letter of interest is going to go down. So I would say if you're in an application that has like 10 signals, you can probably expect maybe a 1% yield on your letter of interest. If you send 100, you're going to get like one or two interviews. So it's up to you. It probably doesn't cause harm if you like missed multiple rounds of interviews and you're still not getting sent anything. Sure, you can fire it, but I don't know if it's a good return on your investment as opposed to just interview prep and personal wellness. It used to make more sense, but as there's more signals per specialty, it makes less and less sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think that ultimately the signals are, they are the interest letter, right? So,
Up to you ultimately.
yeah. Yeah. All right. What else? Scheduling interviews. Does it matter if you take earlier versus later? I don't think so. I don't think it should. I don't think the timing should matter. I think fundamentally speaking, if you are, interviewing at a interview slot, you're being considered.
Yeah,
That's how I see it.
shouldn't matter.
Yeah.
For challenges or those basic questions, you want to try and focus on experiences had in medical school more so than those prior. It really depends. Some people will have had a lot of life experiences between undergrad and medical school. I would think if they're asking you a question about your character as a person and challenges you've overcome, maybe focus on experiences since you've been an adult, unless you had an extremely formative experience before that that really like defined your life or something. I don't think it needs to be in medical school. They're not really going to know when the experience is from. If you had a challenging experience in your gap year, you don't necessarily have to say that unless it's really, in the context of the story. So just pick the best story, the thing that is the most true to you and in your adult life, preferably. And I think you'll have a good answer.
Yeah. I think we missed one by Eric also earlier. It was said that if you're stumped, do you ask to return to that question or do you fumble? I think if you're stumped, it's totally okay to just say, "Hey, can I take a minute to think about the answer?" That's totally fine,
Yeah.
right? So if there's a difficult question, that's what you should do. Tell them, "Can I take a moment to think about it?" Gather your thoughts. Try not to fumble. All right. Don't return to the question. That's weird.
You have to
Uh,
try to answer it.
yeah. All right, let's go apply to multiple tracks for the same program. I think we're kind of a little bit past the point of where that question really matters. But if you're interested in multiple tracks, I guess, sure. I don't know.
There might be programs that have like a specific education track or a specific like thing that isn't necessarily an ERAS but something you opt into. But if it's truly like multiple things on ERAS, like multiple different programs, um, that's a very program specific question. So hard for us to answer.
Right. And when do you start turning down interviews that you're less interested in? I think you should take for sure up to 10. No matter what specialty you are, no matter how competitive you are, I think everybody should take 10 interviews if you get 10. Once you're at 10, I think that's when you can start being more selective. I have seen people match their last rank at after interviewing at 18 places. So take with that what you will. Things happen, right? There's the mentality of like, hey, I'm going to take every single interview that I can because I don't want to risk anything. And then there's the mentality of I am in a fortuitous position where I have more interviews than I kind of really need. And there's like one or two programs that I actually have zero interest in because I just don't want to live in XYZ place or I just heard bad things or whatever. And I'm going to just kind of let someone else take that spot, right? And that's totally fine because, in your head, you're kind of like, I really don't want to be there. Like, it would actually be really bad if I ended up there. And that's totally fine. But I think 10 is kind of like the golden number that everybody should go for.
Yeah.
Try to
There's
hit.
there's published data on the number of interviews and the percent of people who match. And it's once you get to 10 for pretty much every specialty, you're well above 90%. But then there's kind of a point of diminishing returns at different numbers where it sort of hits like 99% match. So maybe I think for the year I was applying radiology, it was 14 or 13 was the magic number, where after that like no one there's no 100% match rate. It's like everyone is 99% after that. So you can look up that data, but 10 to 15 above that, you're not really increasing your odds dramatically. You can obviously take whatever interview you want to take if you're genuinely interested, but if you don't think that you would want to go there, please release the interview to other applicants. I think we have one person who's raising their hand, so I'll ask them to unmute, I guess.
Yeah, I messaged him. I asked him to put the question in the chat just so everybody can, see the question.
Okay.
So here his thoughts on correspondence after the interview. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody like writes a thank you email these days. I feel like that's like become standard. Um, do you need to do it? Look, I'm not putting in a different rank for someone for a thank you email. I don't think most people are going to change their ranking of you for an email. Okay. I think there's definitely a tiny percentage of people out there that care
Traditional
about,
people.
yeah, that care about that stuff. And the majority of us literally have 3,000 unread emails in our inbox and could not care less for another 200 over the course of November to January. Okay. So that's my thoughts. I don't think you need it. I don't think it adds a lot of value. I think it's like a more of I think it's one of those things that you do for yourself and not for the actual person that you're sending it to. Um, so that's kind of my thoughts on it personally. But I think a lot of people are going to say do it anyway. And a lot of people are doing it. People are going to do it. And there's nothing really I don't really think anything's being gained from the practice besides inbox clutter. But sure,
If
if it
if
makes
you feel like it would make you feel more secure and give you less anxiety, go ahead and do it. Maybe have a template worked out where you just put in some reflections into like a little like blank space in the template immediately after the interview so they know it's not just copied and pasted. And then copy and paste it in there with their name and the little reflection. So it takes you the minimal amount of time because you should not be spending a lot of time on this. It shouldn't be causing a lot of anxiety. You don't have to do it. I didn't do it, but a lot of people do. So it might make you feel better.
love it. All right, guys. So in the interest of time, we'll kind of pause, put a pin in it here. I want to thank everyone for coming. Like I said, if you're interested in interview prep, you can fill out a form here. You can join, kind of check us out on our website at matchpalmedical.com. We have all of our offerings there. Learn more about our team. Follow us on Instagram. We're most active. We also have a Twitter and TikTok as well. And, stay tuned for the next event. Hopefully.